The door to the Redemption Bank and Trust didn't swing open. It exploded. Wood splintered inward like a spray of shrapnel, but the concussion of the blast echoing the sudden collective gasp of the half-dozen patrons inside. Zebulon Hayes, standing at the teller's window to deposit the meager proceeds from his latest cattle sale, was thrown back a step. His hand, which had been sliding a canvas pouch across the polished wood, instinctively went to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. But before his fingers could close around the grip, the space was filled with motion and menace. 3 men spilled through the ruined doorway, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, their long coats failing to hide the rifles they held with practiced ease. The air moments before, thick with the scent of paper money ink and floor polish, now tasted of gunpowder and metallic fear. A woman screamed a high, thin sound that was cut short by the sharp crack of a rifle butt striking the floor. Silence. The voice was a low growl, rough as granite. The leader stepped forward, his movements economical and devoid of panic. He was taller than the others, his shoulders broad beneath his duster. His eyes, visible above the bandana, were the color of a winter sky, cold, pale, and unforgiving. This is a simple transaction. Your cooperation ensures your continued breathing. Zebulon remained still, his body coiled tight as a spring. He was not a lawman, nor was he a fool. He had seen enough violence in his life to know when to stand and when to wait. His gaze flickered around the room. The bank manager, Mr. Abernathy, a man whose courage was measured in interest rates, was already trembling behind the counter, his hands held high. The young clerk, a boy of no more than 17, looked as if he might faint. The other patrons were frozen, a tableau of terror. One of the outlaws began stuffing cash into a sack, his movements hurried but efficient. The second stood guard by the shattered door, his rifle aimed at the street. But the leader, the man with the winter eyes, ignored the money. He moved with a chilling deliberation toward the bank manager's office, his boots sounding like hammer falls on the wood floor. He kicked the door open and disappeared inside. Zebulon's mind worked quickly, calculating angles, counting seconds. The man at the door was focused outward. The one at the counter was distracted by his greed. He could draw on the one at the counter, use the chaos too. A sharp, metallic click broke his train of thought. The leader re-emerged from the office, but he wasn't holding a sack of money. In his gloved hand, he held a small silver locket, its chain dangling. He held it up to the light, turning it over, as if inspecting a piece of fine jewelry. Mr. Abernathy found his voice a reedy, desperate squeak. "Please take the money, just... That's a personal effect. It belonged to my wife." The leader's cold eyes flicked toward Abernathy. He said nothing. Instead, he slowly, deliberately opened the locket. Zebulon was too far away to see the image inside, but he didn't need to. He knew the locket. His heart seized in his chest, a cold fist closing around it. The intricate filigree of vines and leaves etched into the silver was unmistakable. It was identical to the one he had given his wife Sarah on their first anniversary a lifetime ago. A custom piece the silversmith had sworn one of a kind. The world seemed to slow, the sounds of the robbery fading to a distant hum. Zebulon saw not the dusty bank, but a sunlit meadow. He saw Sarah's smile as she opened the small velvet box, her fingers tracing the silver leaves. He heard her laughter, a sound he had not truly heard in 5 long years. The memory was so vivid, so painful, it was like a physical blow. An heirloom, the outlaw leader said, his voice laced with a strange, hollow tone. He snapped the locket shut. "Some things are worth more than money, wouldn't you agree?" He didn't look at Abernathy when he spoke. His gaze swept the room, and for a searing second met Zebulon's. There was no recognition in those eyes, only a chilling emptiness. Yet Zebulon felt a jolt, a current of dark energy that seemed to connect them across the space. The outlaw pocketed the locket. "We're done here." He gestured to his men, and as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone, melting back through the splintered doorway into the blinding afternoon sun. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the young clerk's ragged breathing and the soft, pitiful sobs of Mr. Abernathy. Zebulon's hand fell from his gun. The heat of the moment had passed, leaving behind a profound and unsettling chill. It wasn't just a robbery. The money had been an excuse. The leader Silas Kane, as he would later be named, had come for that locket. And in that singular, inexplicable act of theft, he had stolen more than a piece of silver. He had reached into the locked-away vault of Zebulon's past and desecrated a memory. The grief Zebulon had buried under years of hard labor and stoic silence was suddenly violently unearthed. He stood frozen in the wreckage of the bank and the dust settling around him, and knew with a certainty that defied logic that this was not over. This was a beginning. The weeks that followed the robbery settled into the familiar, grueling rhythm of solitude. Zebulon's ranch was a testament to his nature, functional, stark, and stubbornly enduring. The cabin was built of solid timber, hewn by his own hand, and the corrals were sturdy. The fields were cleared of rock through sheer force of will. It was a place that demanded work, and Zebulon gave it willingly for. In the ache of his muscles and the sweat on his brow, he found a temporary reprieve from the hollowness within. He worked, he ate, he slept. The litany was a shield against the ghosts that haunted the quiet hours. But the image of the locket would not fade. It returned to him in the shimmering heat rising from the plains, in the glint of the moon on the water trough, in the silent space across the dinner table where Sarah had once sat. The theft had been a violation, a sacrilege. It was as if this Silas Kane had known his deepest wound and pressed a thumb into it. The landscape that surrounded him was a mirror of his soul, vast, beautiful, and profoundly lonely. It was a land of extremes, where the endless sweep of sagebrush, shimmering under a sky the color of bleached bone, could give way to violent thunderstorms that turned the dry arroyos into raging torrents. He had once shared its beauty with Sarah, pointing out the way the setting sun painted the distant mesas in shades of fire and rose. Now he saw only the emptiness, a canvas wiped clean of joy. It was on a sweltering Tuesday a day, when the air itself seemed to buzz with heat, that the stagecoach from the east arrived trailing a plume of dust that was visible for miles. Zebulon was in redemption for supplies his wagon loaded with sacks of flour and salt. He watched from the shade of the mercantile's porch as the coach rattled to a halt in front of the hotel. Doors opened and weary travelers spilled out, blinking in the harsh sunlight. Among them was a woman who seemed to carry her weariness not as a burden, but as a shield. She was slender, dressed in a faded but clean calico dress, and she moved with a protective grace that drew his eye. She clutched the hand of a small boy, perhaps 4 years old, whose solemn face was half hidden in the folds of her skirt. Her free hand rested constantly on his shoulder, a small, anchoring gesture. As a rough-looking prospector stumbled past them reeking of whiskey, she instinctively pulled her son closer, shielding his eyes from the town's coarseness. There was a quiet desperation in her posture, but it was overshadowed by a steely resolve. He saw it in the set of her jaw, the way her gaze swept the street, assessing, searching. She was a woman adrift, but she was not broken. Zebulon, a man who knew the architecture of loss, recognized the look of someone trying to hold the pieces of their world together with sheer will. He turned away, the sight stirring an uncomfortable empathy in his chest. He had his own ghosts. He had no room for anyone else's. Later, as he loaded the last of his supplies, he saw her again. She was speaking to the hotel clerk, her back straight, her voice too low for him to hear. The clerk, a man with a perpetually sour expression, shook his head dismissively. The woman's shoulders slumped just for a second before she straightened them again. She took her son's hand and led him away, walking with a purpose that seemed to have no destination. He found them an hour later at the edge of town, near the abandoned livery. The boy was asleep in her arms, his small face peaceful against the backdrop of her exhaustion. She stood staring out at the vast prairie, as if trying to divine a path forward from the shimmering heat. She did not seem to see Zebulon approach his boots, silent in the thick dust. He stopped a respectful distance away, the awkwardness of the situation settling on him like a shroud. Words did not come easily to him, especially not words of comfort. She finally noticed him, her body tensing. Fear and suspicion clouded her eyes. She clutched her son tighter, a lioness protecting her only cub. Zebulon cleared his throat, the sound rough. He had no plan, no reasoned thought for why he had followed her. He only knew that the sight of her and the boy so utterly alone had struck a chord deep inside him, a chord he thought had long since rusted into silence. He saw not a stranger, but a reflection of his own desolate journey. He saw loss he understood too well. "I need a housekeeper." The words came out gruff, stripped of any preamble or softness. They hung in the hot, still air between them, plain and unadorned as a fence post. Phoebe stared at him, her eyes narrowing. She had seen him in town, a broad-shouldered man, who moved with a heavy quietness, his face a mask of weary resolve. Men who offered help to lone women usually wanted something in return, something she was no longer willing to give. "I'm not looking for charity, sir," she said, her voice taut. The boy in her arms, James, stirred at the sound, his sleepy eyes blinking open to study the stranger. "It's not charity," Zebulon replied, his gaze steady. "It's a job. The pay is fair. Room and board for you and the boy. The work is hard, but the roof is sound." She searched his face for a hint of guile, for the familiar predatory gleam she had come to expect. She found none. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a deep, settled sadness that resonated with her own. It was this more than his offer that made her hesitate. He was a man acquainted with sorrow. "My boy," she said, her hand stroking James's hair, "he won't be a nuisance. Boys are meant to make noise." Zebulon said a statement of fact, not reassurance. A shadow passed over his features, so fleeting she might have imagined it. He glanced down at James, and for a fraction of a second, the harsh lines around his mouth softened. Before she could answer, the rhythmic clatter of a horse and buggy interrupted them. Sheriff Brody pulled up, a portly man whose badge seemed to be the only thing holding his sweat-stained shirt together. He tipped his hat, his curious gaze moving from Zebulon to Phoebe and the child. "Zebulon," he said, his tone friendly, "didn't expect to see you holding court at the edge of town." He gave Phoebe a polite, if assessing, nod. "Ma'am." Sheriff Zebulon acknowledged. "Any more thoughts on that bank business?" Brody asked, leaning on the side of his buggy. "Still got the whole town spooked. I sent a wire to the marshals in Prescott, but who knows when we'll hear back." Zebulon's jaw tightened. No new thoughts. "Strangest thing," Zeb the sheriff continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "We finished tallying the take. They left behind a whole drawer of silver dollars. Didn't just take the cash either. Old Abernathy's still caterwauling about some locket they took from his office safe. Silas seemed personal about it, like he was looking for something specific." Zebulon's expression didn't change, but Phoebe saw a flicker in the depths of his dark eyes, a distant fire being stoked. The name Silas hung in the air, weighted with unspoken significance. "A man who robs a bank for a keepsake isn't just a thief," Zebulon said, his voice low and gravelly. "He's a ghost." Sheriff Brody grunted, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. Well, ghost or not, I'd like to see him in a pine box. You keep your eyes peeled out at your spread. No telling where that scum will turn up. He gave Zebulon a final nod, tipped his hat again to Phoebe, and clucked his horse into motion, leaving them once more in a cloud of dust and silence. The interruption had broken the tension. Phoebe looked from the departing buggy back to the man before her. His offer still stood between them, a bridge across an unknown chasm. She was tired of running, tired of the fear that gnawed at her insides. The weariness in her bones was a physical ache. Looking at this stoic, solitary man, she felt not fear, but a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, a possibility. "I'll earn my keep," she said the words a vow. Zebulon simply nodded. He turned and started walking toward his wagon, not waiting to see if she would follow. He expected her to. The quiet certainty of it was more compelling than any argument. Phoebe took a deep breath, shifted James on her hip, and followed him. As they walked back through the main street, the whispers started the sideways glances from behind curtains and over cracker barrels. She felt the sting of judgment, the familiar shame, but this time it was different. She was not walking alone. The solid, silent man beside her was a bulwark against the tide of gossip, though he never spoke a word in her defense. His presence was its own statement. The roof would be sound, he had said. For now, that was enough. Life on the ranch settled into a fragile routine measured by the rising and setting of the sun. The silence of the house, once a hollow echo of Zebulon's grief, was now punctuated by the soft scrape of Phoebe's broom, the gentle murmur of her voice as she spoke to James, and the boy's occasional startling bursts of laughter. For Zebulon, these small sounds were both a comfort and a disruption, pulling him from the deep, quiet well of his solitude. The peace, however, was short-lived. A week after Phoebe's arrival, Zebulon found the first sign of trouble. He'd gone to the north pasture to check the well, and the scent hit him first, acrid and wrong. The water in the trough was slick with a foul, oily sheen, and floating on the surface were the bodies of 2 bloated crows. Poison. His stomach clenched with a cold, slow-burning anger. It was a petty, malicious act, designed not just to harm his livestock, in which it had failed, but to send a message. He said nothing to Phoebe, not wanting to frighten her. But she saw the new tension in his shoulders when he returned to the cabin, the way his hand rested on his Colt as he scanned the horizon. He spent the next day digging a new well, his movements hard and furious, the thud of the pickaxe a substitute for the words he wouldn't speak. A few nights later, they were startled awake by a frantic lowing from the corral. Zebulon was out the door in an instant, rifle in hand. In the pale moonlight, he saw them 2 riders driving a half-dozen of his best cattle out through a cut fence. He fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of the rifle splitting the night. The riders returned fire, their shots wild, and hurried before spurring their horses and vanishing into the darkness, taking the cattle with them. When he returned to the cabin, Phoebe was standing in the doorway, her face pale, holding a cast-iron skillet like a weapon. James was crying behind her skirts. Zebulon's anger gave way to a grim sense of responsibility. This was no longer just about him. "They're gone," he said, his voice rough. He saw the fear in her eyes and felt a fresh stab of fury at the men who had put it there. The next morning, hanging from the gatepost by a piece of twine, was the final chilling message, a dead raven, its black feathers ruffled by the morning breeze. It was a symbol he did not yet understand, but its meaning was clear. This was personal. These were not random acts of banditry. Silas Kane or men who rode for him were targeting him. That afternoon, he took Phoebe out behind the barn. He pushed a Winchester rifle into her hands. It was heavy, and she stumbled under the weight. "You need to learn," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I can't always be here." His hands were rough, but surprisingly gentle, as he showed her how to hold it, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel. He stood behind her, his presence a solid wall at her back, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "Squeeze the trigger, don't pull it. And breathe. Fear will make you miss." Her first shot went wide, kicking up dust 10 feet from the tin can he'd set on a fence post. The recoil slammed the butt of the rifle into her shoulder, and she cried out, stumbling back against him. He steadied her, his hands on her arms. Again he commanded. She set her jaw, ignoring the ache in her shoulder, and fired again. This time the can jumped. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips. Over the next hour, as the sun beat down on them, she learned. With each shot, a piece of her fear was replaced by a hard-won sliver of confidence. Their connection, forged in the silent spaces of shared meals and unspoken grief, was now being tempered in the heat of shared adversity. One evening, Zebulon rode in late, his shirt torn at the shoulder and a dark, bloody gash along his forearm. He'd been tracking the rustlers and had a run-in with one of Cain's scouts. He shrugged it off as a scratch, but Phoebe saw the pain he tried to hide. She made him sit, her hands surprisingly steady as she cleaned the wound with whiskey and bound it with clean strips of linen. He flinched at the sting of the alcohol, but sat rigid and silent, watching her. Her touch was practical, efficient, yet it carried a tenderness that felt foreign and achingly familiar. "Thank you," he grunted when she was done. "You're welcome," she replied softly, her fingers lingering for a moment on the bandage. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the warm lantern light of the cabin, the roles between them shifted. She was no longer just a housekeeper, a refugee he had taken in. She was a partner in this struggle. He was no longer just her employer, a silent benefactor. He was a man she was helping to mend. The threats from the outside were forcing them closer, weaving their solitary lives together, thread by thread. The dead raven was a portent, a question mark hanging in the dry air. Zebulon knew it wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was a symbol, a piece of a language he didn't speak. The targeted aggression, the escalating pressure, it all felt less like a prelude to a larger raid and more like a slow, deliberate tightening of a noose. He could no longer afford to wait for Silas Cain to make his next move. He had to understand why he was being hunted. Leaving Phoebe and James at the ranch with a trusted ranch hand and a stern warning to stay close to the cabin, Zebulon saddled his horse and rode south toward the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. His destination was a dusty one-street town in the next county, a place where retired lawmen and old prospectors went to let the sun bake the memories from their bones. He was looking for a man named Elias Thorne, a former U.S. Marshal who it was said knew the history of every outlaw family west of the Pecos. He found Thorne on the porch of a dusty cantina, a gnarled old man with eyes that had seen too much nursing a glass of warm whiskey. Zebulon laid a few coins on the table and sat down. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'm looking for information on a man named Silas Cain," he said. Thorne squinted at him, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Cain. Now that's a name that leaves a bad taste. Vicious as a cornered rattler and twice as mean. Why's a rancher like you asking about Silas?" "He and his men have taken an interest in my property." Zebulon set his voice flat. Thorne took a slow sip of his whiskey. "Silas doesn't take an interest in property. He takes an interest in people. He's a man who runs on hate. It's the only fuel he's got." The old lawman leaned back the chair, groaning in protest. The Cains were always a hard lot. Old man Cain was a brute, and he raised Silas in his own image. But there was another one, a younger brother, Daniel. Zebulon felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck, The name was a ghost, a half-forgotten echo from a part of his life he had walled off long ago. Daniel was different. Thorne continued, his voice growing softer, tinged with something like regret. He wasn't like the others. He was quiet, worked hard, wanted something better than the life he was born into. Heard he went to work for the railroad, trying to make a clean start. The old man sighed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Then he was killed. Some kind of accident on the line years back. A real tragedy. After that, Silas went from being mean to being something else entirely. Something broken and venomous. He blamed the world for Daniel's death. Blames everyone. Zebulon rode home under a sky bruised with the colors of sunset. Thorne's words echoing in his mind. Daniel, the railroad? A forgotten face swam up from the depths of his memory. A young man, barely more than a boy, eager and hard-working, with eyes full of a future he would never see. A spike of cold dread pierced through him. But the full connection remained just out of reach, shrouded in the fog of a guilt he had refused to examine for years. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Phoebe was waging her own war against the past. In her efforts to bring order and cleanliness to the cabin, which felt like the only thing she could control, she decided to tackle Zebulon's small, cluttered office. Dust lay thick on a stack of old ledgers and maps. As she wiped down a bookshelf, her cloth caught on the corner of a small locked metal box tucked away behind a row of books. Her curiosity piqued. She worked the simple lock with a hairpin, a skill learned during harder times. The lock sprang open with a soft click. Inside, nestled in yellowed papers, was a small, faded photograph of a smiling woman, with kind eyes, Sarah, she presumed, and a lock of a child's hair tied with a blue ribbon. Beneath them was a bundle of letters tied with twine. She knew she shouldn't. It was a violation of the fragile trust between them. But a force stronger than her sense of propriety compelled her. She needed to understand the silent man who had saved her. She carefully untied the bundle. Most were business letters, receipts, and deeds. But one was different. It was written in Zebulon's own hand, and the script heavy and dark on a creased piece of paper, dated 5 years prior. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was a confession written to the wind. It was my call. The letter began. The rain had made the ground soft, but the company pushed for speed. I should have stopped the work. I should have waited. The chain snapped. I can still hear it. He was a good kid, eager to prove himself. He looked at me with such trust. His name was Daniel Kane. God forgive me, because I never will. Phoebe's breath caught in her throat. Daniel Kane. The words on the page seemed to burn. She looked up, her gaze falling on the raven feather she had found and placed in a small jar on the mantel. A symbol of death. A messenger. Suddenly, everything became terrifyingly clear. The poisoned well, the stolen cattle, the targeted harassment. This wasn't about land or money. This was about a ghost. And he had come home to haunt them. Zebulon returned to the ranch well after dark, the miles having done little to settle the disquiet in his soul. The name Daniel Kane was a stone in his gut. He stabled his horse and walked toward the cabin, and the warm glow from the window a beacon in the oppressive darkness. When he stepped inside, he found Phoebe waiting for him at the table. The metal box was open between them, and the letter lying starkly on the wooden surface. Her eyes, when she looked at him, were not filled with the accusation he expected, but with a deep, sorrowful understanding. His brother's name is Silas Zebulon, said the words, tasting like ash. It wasn't a question. He knew. In that moment, seeing the letter in her hands and saying the name aloud, all the pieces clicked into place with the terrible finality of a cell door locking shut. The locket, identical to Sarah's, now made a twisted kind of sense. It wasn't just a random piece of jewelry. Silas must have seen Sarah wear it in town years ago, or perhaps his brother Daniel had described it in a letter home. To Silas, it was a symbol of the life, the happiness that Zebulun had, while his own brother lay dead. Silas hadn't stolen a locket. He had stolen a symbol of Zebulun's life, the one he intended to dismantle piece by piece. The dead raven on the gatepost was a marker, a sign of a debt Cain believed was owed. The guilt Zebulun had carried like a shroud for 5 years descended on him with crushing force. He had buried the memory of Daniel Cain's death under a mountain of stoic denial, telling himself it was a tragic accident, a misfortune of the work. But the truth, the one he confessed only to a piece of paper in the dead of night, was that it had been his failing, his responsibility. He had been the foreman. He had made the call to keep the crew working in unsafe conditions, bowing to pressure from the railroad company. He had traded a young man's life for a deadline. He sank into the chair opposite Phoebe, the weight of it all bowing his broad shoulders. "He wants revenge," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "He's not after my land. He's after me." The entire conflict was recontextualized. This was not a fight for his property. It was a reckoning with his past. Silas Cain was no longer a simple outlaw, a faceless villain driven by greed. He was a man twisted by grief, fueled by a righteous, albeit warped, sense of justice. He was a dark mirror of Zebulun himself, another man hollowed out by loss. In a way, Zebulun understood the man's rage. He had felt that same impotent fury at the universe when he had lost his own family to fever. The difference was where they had aimed it. Zebulun had turned his inward, letting it consume him in silence. Silas had turned his outward, honing it into a weapon. Phoebe reached across the table, her hand covering his. Her touch was a small, warm anchor in the storm of his regret. "This isn't your fault, Zebulun," she said softly. "Isn't it?" He looked at his own large, calloused hands, hands that had built a life and also signed off on a death warrant. "I made a choice. A boy died because of it. His brother is just collecting the debt." The stakes had irrevocably shifted. This was no longer about survival. It was about atonement. The fight ahead was not just against Silas Cain, but against the ghosts of his own making. And for the first time, he was not facing them alone. He looked at Phoebe, at the strength and compassion in her face, and felt a flicker of something he hadn't known he was capable of anymore. The will to not just endure, but to fight for a future he didn't believe he deserved. The storm came from the west, a bruised and turbulent wall of dust that swallowed the horizon. The sky turned a sickly shade of ochre, and the wind began to howl, stripping leaves from the cottonwoods and whipping sand against the cabin walls with the force of buckshot. It was an afternoon made for hiding, for waiting out nature's fury. James, restless from being cooped up, was playing with his wooden soldiers on the porch just within the shelter of the overhang. Zebulun and his most trusted ranch hand, a wiry old timer named Hank, were in the south pasture, frantically reinforcing a fence line they feared the wind might bring down. Phoebe watched James from the kitchen window, her nerves stretched taut by the oppressive atmosphere. The diversion was brutally simple and effective. A flicker of orange on the far side of the northern pasture. A small, deliberately set grass fire, its smoke instantly seized by the gale and smeared across the sky. Hank saw it first. Fire. Zebulun's head snapped up. In this wind, even a small blaze could become an inferno in minutes. "Get the water barrels," he yelled, already running for the barn. There was no time to think, only to react. He and Hank galloped toward the smoke, their world narrowed to the immediate, desperate task of containment. Phoebe's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw them ride off, then turned back to the porch. James inside now. But the porch was empty. A cold dread washed over her. James, she called, her voice thin against the roaring wind. She ran outside, the dust stinging her eyes. James. The wind tore the name from her lips. He couldn't have gone far. He was chasing a tumbleweed maybe, or had followed a lizard around the corner of the house. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at her throat. She circled the cabin, then the barn, her calls growing more frantic. He was gone. The dust storm had swallowed him whole. Just as the first wave of true terror threatened to overwhelm her, she saw it. Pinned to the cabin door by the point of a gleaming Bowie knife was a piece of tanned leather. Her hands trembled as she worked it free. Scratched into the surface were a few crude words. An eye for an eye, the old rail yard, sundown, alone. The breath left her body in a ragged sob. It was a lie. The fire was a lie. It was all a trap, a perfectly orchestrated move to draw Zebulon away and take the one thing he had come to protect. Silas had taken her son. When Zebulon and Hank returned, having beaten out the small, insignificant fire, they found her on her knees in front of the cabin, clutching the piece of leather, her face a mask of stony despair. Zebulon saw the empty porch and the knife hole in the door, and he knew. The world tilted on its axis. The guilt over Daniel Kane was an old, familiar ache. This was a new and unbearable agony. This was his fault. He had brought this danger into her life, into James's life. Phoebe rose to her feet, her terror giving way to a white-hot fury that burned away her tears. She was no longer a victim. She looked at Zebulon, her eyes blazing. "Get my son back," she said, her voice like steel. There was no plea in it, only a command, an article of faith. She grabbed the rifle she had been practicing with her movements, sure and steady. "We'll face the rest together." Zebulon looked at her, at the fierce, unyielding strength that had been forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. He felt a surge of resolve so powerful, it momentarily eclipsed his fear. This was not just about his past anymore. It was about their future. He took the scrap of leather from her hand, his knuckles white. He would go to the rail yard. He would face Silas Kane. He would settle this debt one way or another. The abandoned rail yard was a skeleton picked clean by time and neglect. Skeletal train cars rusted, and hollow sat silently on tracks that disappeared into the overgrown weeds. The wind, the last gasp of the dying dust storm, whistled through the broken windows and creaked a loose tin sign back and forth with a rhythmic, maddening groan. Dusk bled across the sky, casting the entire scene in long, distorted shadows. It was a boneyard, a perfect stage for a final confrontation. Zebulon dismounted at the edge of the yard, tying his horse loosely to a dead tree. He moved forward on foot, his Winchester held ready, his senses on fire. Every scrape of metal, every rustle of the wind sounded like a threat. He saw Silas Kane standing in the open between two hulking boxcars. He was alone. In one hand, he held a pocket watch, its ticking unnervingly loud in the relative silence. "You're punctual, Hayes," Silas called out, his voice carrying an eerie calm. "I appreciate that in a man. It speaks to a sense of responsibility." "Where is the boy?" Zebulon's voice was a low growl. "He's safe," Silas said, snapping the watch shut and pocketing it. "For now. He's a quiet boy. Reminds me of my brother." The name hung between them, a ghost summoned. Daniel was quiet too. He trusted people. He trusted the foreman who sent him to work under a crane with a frayed chain on ground, soft as a fresh grave. Silas took a step forward, his hand hovering over the Colt at his hip. "I don't just want you dead, Hayes. That's too easy. I want you to say it. I want you to tell me why my brother had to die while you got to live. I want you to confess." This was his aim. Not just murder, but absolution through confession. He wanted Zebulun to break to admit his guilt before he died. "It was an accident," Zebulun said, the old lie tasting bitter on his tongue. "Was it?" Silas sneered. "Or was it a choice? You chose the railroad's deadline over the lives of your men. You chose profit over a human soul, my brother's soul." From the shadows of a nearby train car, a figure emerged, leveling a shotgun at Zebulun. Zebulun's blood ran cold. It was one of his own ranch hands, a man named Cole, the same man who had been most vocal in his disapproval of Phoebe, the same man who had called her a curse. Cole Zebulun breathed the betrayal, a fresh, sharp wound. "He paid me." Cole said, his face pale with sweat and fear. "Just wanted me to keep him informed. I didn't know he'd take the boy." "Everyone has a price," Hayes Silas said with a chilling smile. "Yours is guilt, his is greed." The standoff was a tight wire of tension. 3 men, 3 guns, and a history of pain that had reached its flashpoint. Zebulun knew he couldn't fight them both. He had to make a choice. His eyes darted around the yard, seeking any advantage. He saw a length of rusted chain hanging from a derelict crane above Cole. "You're right," Cain Zebulun said, his voice changing, softening. "It was a gamble. It wasn't just an accident. It was my fault. I was the foreman. The responsibility was mine. I've lived with that every day." For a second, Silas's cold composure wavered. He had wanted the confession, and hearing it seemed to momentarily disarm him. It was the opening Zebulun needed. He fired not at Silas, but at the rusted hook holding the chain above Cole. The chain dropped with a deafening crash, striking the ground next to the traitorous ranch hand. Cole yelled in shock, dropping his shotgun as he stumbled back. In that same instant, Zebulun dove behind a stack of rotting railroad ties as Silas, recovering his senses, fired. A bullet splintered the wood inches from Zebulun's head. The fight was on. Gunshots echoed through the boneyard, flashes of orange light in the deepening twilight. Zebulun moved from cover to cover, his mind racing. He wasn't just fighting for his life or for James. He was fighting to be the man Phoebe believed him to be, the man who deserved a second chance at a family. He circled around a flatbed car and came up behind Silas. He had a clear shot. He could end it right there. End the man who had terrorized him, kidnapped a child, and resurrected all his demons. The old Zebulun, the one consumed by grief and rage, would have pulled the trigger without hesitation. Vengeance for vengeance. An eye for an eye. But looking at Silas Cain's back, he saw not a monster, but a man broken by the same grief that had almost destroyed him. Killing him would be an act of revenge, making him no better than the man he faced. It would be an ending, but not a redemption. He wanted justice, not vengeance. "Cain," he yelled. Silas spun around, raising his pistol. But Zebulun was faster. He fired once. His bullet struck the gun in Silas's hand, sending it flying into the darkness with a metallic clang. Silas cried out, clutching his shattered hand, his face a mask of disbelief and pain. He stared at Zebulun, defeated. The sound of approaching horses broke the sudden silence. Sheriff Brody and a posse of townsmen, alerted by a frantic Phoebe who had ridden for help. With the moment Zebulun left, thundered into the rail yard, lanterns held high. The climax was over. Justice had arrived. The arrival of the sheriff and his posse broke the spell of the rail yard. The flickering lantern light cast dancing shadows that seemed to chase away the ghosts of the confrontation. Silas Cain, clutching his wounded hand, offered no resistance as Sheriff Brody clamped irons on his wrists. Cole, the traitorous ranch hand, was found cowering behind the fallen chain and was swiftly taken into custody. His blubbering apologies ignored. But Zebulon had no eyes for them. His gaze swept the yard, a frantic, desperate search. "The boy," he said to the sheriff, his voice raw. "Where is he?" Silas, being led away, stopped and gave a final bitter laugh. "He's safe. I'm not a monster, Hayes. Not like you." He jerked his head toward the largest of the boxcars. "I wouldn't harm a child." Zebulon ran his boots crunching on the gravel. He wrenched the heavy sliding door open. Inside, nestled on a pile of old blankets in the corner, was James. He was awake, his eyes wide in the sudden glare of the lanterns, but he was unharmed. A half-eaten apple lay beside him. James Zebulon breathed relief so profound it made his knees weak. The boy looked up at him, his expression solemn. Then his face crumpled, and he launched himself into Zebulon's arms, burying his face in his chest, his small body trembling with silent sobs. Zebulon wrapped his arms around him, holding him tight, his own eyes burning. He had him. He was safe. He carried James out of the boxcar just as Phoebe arrived, having ridden with the posse. She slid from her horse before it had fully stopped running toward them. She didn't say a word. She simply reached them and threw her arms around both Zebulon and her son, pulling them into a fierce, desperate embrace. It was the first time Zebulon had initiated such open affection, the first time he had allowed himself to be the center of a family's embrace, since Sarah and his own boy were gone. He held them, the solid weight of James in one arm, the trembling strength of Phoebe in the other, and felt a profound shift deep within him. The hollow space he had carried for so long was for the first time filled. He looked at Phoebe over James's head, her face stained with dust and tears, and saw his future. He saw the home he thought he had lost forever. Sheriff Brody approached them, his expression softened by the scene. "It's over, Zeb. It's finally over." Zebulon knotted his throat tight. He looked down at Phoebe, whose eyes were locked on his, shining with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a love that needed no words. "It's over," he echoed, his voice thick with emotion. He gently disentangled one arm and cupped her cheek, his rough thumb wiping away a tear. "Let's go home." The line, once a simple offer to a desperate stranger, was now a promise, an anchor. It was a vow earned through shared trauma and triumph, and it carried the immense emotional weight of all they had endured. Together, the three of them turned away from the wreckage of the past and walked toward the waiting horses, a new and unlikely family bound together not by blood, but by the resilient threads of love and survival. A week passed. The dust settled both literally and figuratively. Silas, Kane, and Cole were gone, transported to the federal prison at Yuma, their dark chapter in redemption's history closed. The rhythms of the ranch returned, but they were different now. The silence was no longer heavy with grief, but comfortable with shared peace. The house was filled with the sounds of James's laughter, a constant, joyful melody that seemed to chase the last of the shadows from the corners. One clear, cool afternoon, Zebulon asked Phoebe to walk with him. He led her not to the fields or the creek, but to a small, quiet rise behind the cabin, where two simple wooden crosses stood beneath the shade of a lone, ancient oak. The grass was kept neat, and a few stubborn wildflowers grew at the base of the markers. He stopped before them, his hat held in his hands. "This is Sarah," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "And this was our son Samuel." He told her about them, the words coming slowly at first, then with a steady flow, as if a dam had finally broken. He spoke of Sarah's laugh, of the way she loved the wildflowers, of the small dreams they had built together in this vast, lonely land. He spoke of his son, a boy with his mother's eyes taken by the same fever that had claimed her just a week later. For the first time, He shared his grief openly, not as a burden to be endured, but as a memory to be honored. From his pocket, he took the silver locket which Sheriff Brody had recovered from Silas Kane's possessions and returned. It gleamed in the afternoon sun. He didn't open it. He simply held it for a moment, then leaned down and gently placed it on the earth at the base of Sarah's headstone, letting the silver chain curl around the weathered wood. It was a gesture of respect, of remembrance, but also of release. He was leaving the past where it belonged, not forgotten, but honored and at peace. He straightened up and turned to Phoebe, taking her hand in his. Her fingers laced with his, a perfect fit. "The past is a part of me," he said, his gaze clear and direct. "But it's not all of me. My future is with you and James." Phoebe's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy. She squeezed his hand, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "Our future," she corrected him softly. They walked back to the ranch as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of gold and crimson. As they approached the cabin, James came running out to meet them, his face alight with excitement. Tumbling at his heels was a small, clumsy puppy with oversized paws, a gift from Zebulon. The boy's laughter echoed in the cooling air as he and the puppy rolled in the grass. Zebulon and Phoebe stopped on the porch watching him. The silence that fell between them was no longer one of uncertainty or unspoken sorrow, but of shared peace and a profound, quiet love. The warm golden light of the setting sun bathed the ranch, the land their small family. It was a promise of a new day, of a life rebuilt from the ashes of loss. The ghosts were finally quiet, replaced by the vibrant, hopeful sounds of a home reborn.